Is my computer in the way? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, welcome this evening. Ooh, that's loud. I do talk loud. Deceptively loudly. Well, nobody gave me any announcements, so I guess we don't have any, except that homecoming is Sunday. Bring a friend, call people, remind them that you invited them. Please come. Be very hungry. There's going to be a lot of barbecue. Maybe bring some Tupperware just in case. Might have some leftovers. My dad was he got really enthusiastic when he was making the order. So we have quite a lot of meat and baked beans. So we'll have great time, great size, great fellowship. Really looking forward to hearing Becky Shirey and Patty and Scott Lusk are going to be with us doing music, and so it's just going to be really special. And we also have some special surprises planned, some videos and some memories of time gone by, that sort of thing. So I'm really excited about that for Sunday. And one of my friends is going to be with us actually from DC. We're having the Southeastern Medieval Association meeting this weekend at Winthrop, and so she's coming down for that. She's going to stay over. So we're both giving papers because I had the great idea. They were like, yeah, I put in an application to do a paper. Like, are you going to be at that? Like, you live in South Carolina. And I said, well, I'd like to look at it. They extended the deadline, so I said, sure. I'll put in an abstract. And then they accepted it, and now you have to go do it. You're committed. And if you withdraw, it's like, shame on you. Like, you better have like a really good reason. You can't withdraw your paper and still show up. So pray for me. I have to do that. It's about Southern honor and medievalisms, and I can explain what that means later. A lot of people wouldn't know what that means. Anyway, although it's not that hard to figure out, I guess, like from the context clue. But if you're interested, I can talk for a very long time about it. But I won't tonight, because I have other things.
How many closings do you get?
I don't do that. The bell rings and we leave. That's how that works. For anybody who doesn't know, my name is Mikkaela Bailey. If you're joining on the stream, I teach at the college level a lot. My dad's pastor here. I'm a historian. I study the Middle Ages. But I also study the history of religion and Christianity and religious movements. And so I'm very interested in these intellectual connections between different movements. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about this evening. So for those of you in the room, I have a little sheet of some names and events just to help you track, because we're going to move through some of this a lot faster than I would if I was teaching in like a normal classroom setting. So Western Civ 2. So to give a little bit of introduction, I think this is going to be 3 parts. Sorry, you can blame my dad for that. And if anybody doesn't like the history lesson, it's not going to be very Bible-y, because we're talking about history and there's a lot of biblical significance you can bring out, and there are a lot of scriptures that you can quote, but I didn't have that much notice to do that part of it. So I'm doing this part that I know how to do. But it's Christian history, so it's about the sort of like fathers of our church and what they're going through. And so to explain a little bit, throughout history we see all of these patterns emerge. And so what historians do as a profession is that we take pieces of information, we take facts, we take the timeline, and we layer insights on top of it by drawing lines from one thing to the next in these patterns. And so as we layer one thing on top of the next, we start to form conclusions. And not only are we tracking these patterns, but we're making arguments about why things happen the way they do, and we're analyzing cause and effect, among other things. So the reason that I explain all of this is to say that I'm layering meaning onto a series of events, which stretches much further back in time and has a massive cast of characters that I can't really fully develop in a short time like this, but you could spend a whole semester on this topic, frankly, and have lots of exams and papers and much homework and pop quizzes, but I won't do that to you tonight, of course. But, we're trying to understand these people, what they did, and how they impact others around them. And so what I propose is that by looking at these various thinkers, theologians, reformers, and actors, in history we talk about people as being a historical actor. So they're not a character because they're not made up. They're not an actor like a guy on a stage or a guy in a movie, but they act. They are part of actions. So a historical actor is, or a historical figure, I should say. But by looking at these historical figures and better understanding them, then we can better understand the world around us and the world that we're living in. And so I do want to make one rule. This is my rule. Don't say to me, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I can't, because history is not a set of rules or patterns or events that you learn from. And I know why people say that. They're trying, that's their foot in the door to why history is important, right? So I'm glad that some people do think that. But we're taking it further. We're taking another step together. So whenever I'm in a room with people, I ask them not to think this way, because history is so much more than this list of don'ts or this list of signs to look for things. Because if you can see the signs, we're already in the moment. We're already in the pattern, right? So I know a lot of people will say, like, oh, we have to learn about the Holocaust so we don't have another one. Well, we need to learn about the Holocaust to understand what is the cost to humanity for these tragedies and these evil things that are wrought. And how do we move forward as a society? Because inevitably, you're going to face circumstances where great tragedies happen, where great evils occur. And so when we aren't able to cope with that, when we say, like, oh, we just need to learn the past so that we don't do it again, you really can't control the actions of other people, whether they've learned the past or not. But we can learn how to cope with it, and we can learn how to recognize where we are in some of these patterns. But the other caution, I guess, that I would give, the caveat I would give to saying this, is that this is also not a prediction for the future. So I'm not saying that by any means. But I am saying that we're in an interesting pattern in our culture today and in society and in the sort of religious status of the world. People are kind of moving away from Christianity, and other groups of people are moving to it in large numbers. And so it's just really helpful to sort of orient ourselves of where are we in this longer trajectory. But I don't want you to think that I'm giving you a guide of, like, this happened and then this happened and then this happened, so now we can expect that that thing that happened then will then happen now. Because I don't see the future. Can't do that. Not in my job description. But some people do call me, especially when coronavirus broke out. They were like calling me, like, hey, how did the Black Death, like, how did that go? Are we doing that again? And I was like, well, what do you want me to say? It was very bad. A third of Europe died. I don't know what you want. That's not really the happy answer you're looking for. And in modern medicine, I couldn't say, obviously, at the beginning, how anything was going to go. And it did not go quite like the Black Death. So good for us for that. But I guess this is a good moment for us to just open in prayer for a second before we get into the meat of things, and you have to start using your little handouts. So I'll go ahead and lead us. Thank you, Lord, for this evening and this opportunity. Please speak to us, show us what you'd have us to learn tonight, and bless all of those who came out on this rainy evening and who tuned in on the stream. Lead us and guide us and direct us as we leave as well. In your name we pray, amen. So, and this is kind of part one of a series, and I'm calling part one, well, I'm calling the series, it's not, I could have written that up there, I guess, Protest, Reform, Revival, and War. So this is sort of a series of things that go together as culture changes and shifts in history. You see protest, reform, revival, and war deeply connected, and they often come at the same time or one before another. So it's very, I wouldn't say that you could say that, I wouldn't say that one will cause another. Historians argue about that a lot, right? Like, this caused this thing to happen, but no, it was the other way. This caused that thing to happen. So I'm not going to get into the weeds about that, but in part one tonight, I want to talk about evening star to morning star. And so if you see on your sheet, there's a man at the top. His name is John Wycliffe. He's an English reformer living in the late 1300s. And he's called the evening star of scholasticism and the morning star of the Reformation. And so this is sort of our starting point in the intellectual roots of Protestantism. We are Protestants. We're part of the Pentecostal Holiness Church, which is a Protestant denomination. And I'll explain more about what that means and how we get there. So one of the big patterns that you see in the medieval reformers, starting with John Wycliffe, that is so key and important, is the fight over the bureaucratic bloat in the Catholic Church. So this is the state of sort of like Christianity in the Middle Ages, which is what I study. I study the Middle Ages, and Christianity is just sort of unavoidable if you're studying the European Middle Ages. So there's this fight against this bureaucratic bloat in the Catholic Church, where there's so many people at the top level. There's so much control, so many, and not just priests, but bishops, cardinals, all of the people at this sort of top layer of the Catholic Church. They're sucking resources, and they're all very wealthy, so they're being enriched off of their position because they have a lot of power over land. This is how the church funds itself a lot of the time in the Middle Ages, is that they own lots of land and they collect rents from tenants who live on the land, who farm on the land. And they have sometimes enterprises in the monasteries where they're farming and growing, or they have a trade where they produce something. You see that even today. There's several monasteries in the southeast, and there's one in Louisiana. They make soap. It's very nice soap. But that's what they do. They make soap and they sell it, and that's part of the way that they sustain themselves as a monastery. So the medieval reformers, they're not against the monasteries, and they're not against that kind of wealth structure, but what they're against is this overreach. There are too many bureaucrats. It's sort of like when you look at university administration today, what a lot of people complain about is that they have too many administrators. There are too many people on the payroll who don't really have a job. They just are there. They have an office and they get paid and they sort of do something, and nobody's really sure what it is. But apparently it's essential, and the faculty don't get raises and the tuition goes up so that they can pay those salaries for the jobs that must be very important, yet we cannot describe what they do. This is what's happening in medieval Christianity at this time that the reformers are so against. They want to strip it down. They want to have, the Pope is still important. They're not saying that we shouldn't have a Pope, but they are saying that this isn't working and it costs too much money. And they also, there's a big shift in their approach to the Eucharist. So the Eucharist we call Holy Communion. It's the Last Supper. And so for Catholics, it works a bit differently. And so their approach in the Middle Ages oftentimes was that the priest would offer the bread and drink the wine, and the people do not get to drink the wine. And so a lot of the reformers say, no, you should be able to have the bread and the wine and be equal, in certain ways. Not fully equal, because they still oftentimes believe that the priests should have like special privilege, or they have special access, or they're consecrated. But a lot of medieval reformers are also against the concept of transubstantiation. So this is going to come up a lot if you ever read the reformers. And so transubstantiation is the idea that the wine and the bread literally become the body and blood of Christ when they're consecrated by the priest, and that they only look like bread and wine, but they are literally the body and blood of Christ. And so that doctrine is called into question because, right, if the priest can do that, then they control your access to Jesus. And this is important to understand that the reformers are reacting against these things because those are the blockades, those are the structures that mediate your relationship with God. Your access to God is controlled by the church. And so by pushing back on those things, you reduce the importance of church officials and you reduce their authority and their ability to govern people. Because if they can't control people by controlling their relationship with God, and people have access to God on their own, then you have very little control over, your source of wealth, essentially. So the medieval church, for all intents and purposes, is the Catholic Church, at least for our purposes tonight. So there is Eastern Christianity, and there's Celtic Christianity, and there's a few other things. You don't have to worry about that. We're talking about Catholicism and people reacting against it because by and large, Catholicism is the one church at this time. For hundreds of years, they dominate Western Europe as the only sort of Christian movement, and they have the Pope and the College of Cardinals all sort of govern all of Christianity. They set out the rules and regulations for everyone. And so this is where we get to John Wycliffe. He is a Catholic because every Christian in Western Europe at this point is Catholic. He is a clergyman. He's a professor at Oxford. Back then, the way universities worked is that they were for the religious education of men, and so you were what we call religious. So if you're religious, it doesn't just mean that you have religion, but being religious means that you are like a man of the cloth. You're a monk, or you're a priest, or you're pursuing that. You're pursuing vocational ministry, which means a vow of celibacy. It means vows of poverty oftentimes, and typically you don't really get to pick where you go, like where you land. You're assigned places to go. And so there's a lot of context that goes into that is just so important because John Wycliffe is called the evening star of scholasticism and the morning star of the Protestant Reformation. And so we'll unfold more of like his significance as a person and explain a little bit more about this intellectual movement that he's part of. But the evening star and the morning star traditionally are two terms that refer to the same thing, which is the planet Venus. And so there's a lot of imagery here of, the evening star follows the setting sun, and so it sort of emerges in the after. But the morning star leads the rising sun, is the imagery. And you probably know there's a reference in Revelation where Jesus is called the brighting morning star. And so he's sort of like the brightest leading the sunrise. There's a lot of imagery like that. And so John Wycliffe, there's not an accident why he's being given this comparison, because he's pretty radical in his beliefs. He's an academic. He's not trying to start a movement, but he inevitably does. And so he really kicks off this series of reforms that develop into what we think of today as the Protestant Reformation. And so he lives during a really contentious time in England. He's living through from the 1340s, I think, 1330s, 1340s through the 1380s. This is the height of the Black Death. And so you see a resurgence of the Black Death a few times in Europe, and really notably one around the time of the Lutheran Reformation in around 1500, 1515. And so he's living at this point where the clergy has grown really powerful. They have a lot of influence. He's living through this really horrible cataclysmic event. In England, more like half the population died from the Black Death, whereas in like continental Europe, it was more like a third. So a lot more people are dying in England because they're also suffering famine at the same time. So there are a lot of layers to the sort of state of things. And so in 1381, when he is thrown out of Oxford, that's also the year for the Peasants' Revolt, which is one of the really bloody revolts in English history. And he's also living through the midst of the 100 Years' War and some other things, like the Avignon Papacy, and the Western Schism is sort of following right on the tail of that. And so this is part of why he's so significant as a figure in the moment that he's living. Scholasticism, which he is the evening star of scholasticism. Scholasticism is an intellectual movement. It's very focused on rules and regulations. It's very much focused on the systematic theology, the right way to believe things, and it's influenced by Aristotle's like scientific perspectives. All of that to know that this is the way people think that they should do education. This is the way they should educate the clergy, and this is the way they should understand the Bible, theology, tradition, and dogma, right? So Wycliffe is part of the movement away from that and into something else that's often associated with the Renaissance called humanism. Humanism is a different intellectual movement, and so the movement of humanism is more human-centric, whereas scholasticism is more centered on dogma and systems. Humanism is centered more on like human expression and like the way we understand things being more important than the thing itself in some ways. And so you see that pattern emerge again in the Enlightenment hundreds of years later. And so it's very heavily, so humanism is very heavily influenced by Roman writers and the church fathers. And so you see this sort of desire for people to get back to what they think are the roots of the Catholic Church. And when I say the church fathers, I mean the church fathers are men who lived after Acts in the Roman Empire during the early days of the Catholic Church, where they're setting up shop as apostolic succession is under debate. They've selected Rome and Peter. They call it Peter's primacy. It's the line of Peter, who is Bishop of Rome, like the Apostle Peter, is what they're referring to. And so that's how you get the Pope, is that he's the bishop of all bishops because he inherits Peter's seat. And so these are all of the kinds of conflicts that are happening that the church fathers are talking about, and they're talking about what should we believe? You know, what is the right way to understand and interpret the Bible and to know what to believe? And so they're developing a lot of theology at that time. So Wycliffe is called the Morning Star of the Reformation because he is part of this sort of early days of humanism developing and coming to the University of Oxford. And being part of that, he's able to engage in these reforming ideas. So humanism inspires reform for a lot of people. And so this is part of the Renaissance, is this like reawakening, or the rebirth of all of these older ideas, like the rediscovery of these sort of classical opinions that had faded from importance. So you see that like there's this really great intellectual movement happening at the same time as these really big sort of shifts of the Black Death is sort of waning, the Renaissance is happening, humanism is moving in, scholasticism is moving out, you have revolts, and you have like the 100 Years' War and the Avignon Papacy are waning at the same time. So the Avignon Papacy is a really big part of all of this because it's a big part of the conflict of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is a war between England and France. It actually lasts 116 years. I don't know why they call it the 100 Years' War. England loves to name their wars by like the 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. I don't know why they like that, but they do. No one asked me. It's hard to keep track. I don't know, how many years did this one last? I can't remember. But the Avignon papacy really fuels that because what essentially happens is the Pope travels to France under pressure from the French king and sets up sort of a temporary headquarters there. The Pope is supposed to be headquartered in Rome. Everybody's kind of agreed on that because the important thing is that that's Peter's seat. Peter was the Bishop of Rome. So if you take the Pope out of Rome, is he the Pope anymore? That's the big question. So they also call it the Babylonian captivity, which is pretty interesting, like biblical imagery there. So the Pope is in France and dies. And so then the College of Cardinals says, we like it here, we'll stay here. They elect a new Pope. So they elect 7 French popes. This is a big deal. So Pope Francis, today, he's not a Roman. He's from South America. But this is the Pope right now. But that used to be very uncommon. It used to be much more common that the Pope should be from Rome or Italian or, thereabouts. And so this is a big conflict with other places because the Pope has so much authority over Christianity and Christendom. Christendom is like all Christians like living under his rule. So the Pope is so in charge of all of this, but if he's in France, he's under the authority of the French king. He's under the influence of the French king. Because when the Pope is living in Rome, that's the papal state, and it's the same today. The Vatican is its own country, located within the walls of Rome. They're not governed by the Italian government, and it's considered the papal state. And so when the Pope is not in the papal state, this is a problem. This presents a problem for a lot of people, and there's a lot of criticism of this, and it goes on for decades. And so under a lot of pressure from a lot of people, the papacy moves back to Rome, and then you get something called the Western Schism. And so I explain all of that because the Western Schism is something that some other reformers will get involved in. And this is after Wycliffe. Like, Wycliffe is dead at that point. He's the Western Schism is happening in the 15th century, a couple of decades after Wycliffe. So the reason that this is important is because Wycliffe's ideas outlast him. They travel. They last for a very long time. Wycliffe's followers are called Lollards. There's a strong movement of Lollards in England, but there are a lot of Lollards out and about. It's a funny word. It sort of means like mumbling. So some people say that it's because the priests who would carry the dead during the Black Death would like mumble songs and like sort of mumble the last rites as they're like carrying people away. Or they think that maybe people mumbled the scriptures to themselves because the Lollards are really believe in the personal role of your relationship with God. They believe in your sort of personal investment in this, right? Because they think that you should read the scripture yourself. They think that you should know scripture because back then a lot of people can't read. For a lot of people, you go to church, things are in Latin. Usually there's like a sermon that you could probably understand in your own language, but when you go, the songs are in Latin, the scripture's in Latin. You don't speak Latin. I mean, I don't think you guys speak Latin. But medieval peasants certainly did not speak Latin. And so you don't really know. Like, you might know Bible stories, but can you understand it? A lot of people can't. And the Lollards think, and there are other groups who think, I should be able to read the Bible and understand it myself. And that's controversial in some ways, because can you really be trusted to do that? Can you really be trusted to read and understand and know and not be led down the wrong path because you just shouldn't take that upon yourself? It should be done for you by a priest, right? I mean, this is the kind of mindset that this is a bit of a simplification, but this is the kind of mindset that you're working with a lot of the time. So Wycliffe's ideas and Lollard's travel. A really interesting connection that's very important is the connection to Prague. And so Anne of Bohemia is a place, it's in the modern Czech Republic. Anne of Bohemia married Henry III. And she liked John Wycliffe's ideas so much that she spread them around. She's a very educated person, very interested in her own spirituality and her own devotion. And so they go back to the University of Prague, right? This is another pattern that we see is universities being the hotspots for this, because they're hotspots for communication and they're hotspots for like intellectual movements. And so you don't see a lot of discussion in historical narrative at this point of what we would call a revival movement, because it's just not something that the structure of the church can accommodate. The way that we think of revival, or the way we think of like the Second Great Awakening or the First Great Awakening, it can't happen in the Middle Ages, because you can't just have people out in the woods, preaching. You're not allowed to preach without being granted permission by the authority, like by the bishop. So you actually see people with licenses to preach. And lay people can't have that. Lay people cannot preach. And the law lords get in trouble for that a lot, because people say, oh, you're preaching. And they say, I'm not really preaching. But they say, oh, you're preaching in the street, you can't do that. And so what revival looks like in these sorts of intellectual movements is very different than what revival looks like much later, hundreds of years later. But they're connected very deeply. So in Prague, somebody who gets a hold of these, I think I said Henry III. Anna Bohemia is married to Richard II. That was wrong. You don't need to know that really, but somebody is gonna like Google it and tell me later. They're like, haha, you don't know anything. Whatever. Anyway, John Huss, Jan Hus on your sheet, he is influenced by Wycliffe and his ideas. And he lives in Prague, which is far away from, so like, this is my very bad map. So like this is Prague, this is like Germany, and like France and Italy's over here. This is a very bad map. This is England. No one hold me to this. And John Huss is over here. Travel is hard back then, right? So, and this is far. And this is hard to erase for some reason. But ideas travel, and John Huss is, he really believes in reform. And this is coming and fueling a reform movement that's already happening in Prague. So this is what I'm saying, is that a lot of these movements are happening and they connect, but they are not inspired by one another. They're happening at the same time because they're seeing the same problems and they're inspired by the same things. So John Huss is in Prague, and he is fighting this sort of ongoing battle. He's part of this resistance to the structure of the Catholic Church and this bloat and this sort of economic issue. And so in Prague, they've kind of had an ongoing discussion over, the church wants too much. The church is gaining too much money through, not just through tithes, but by selling indulgences and other things like this. And this comes up again with Martin Luther. Indulgences for Catholics are sort of a way to accrue. This is not a great way to think about it, but a brief sort of comparison would be that, you have like a reward card, Like if you go to Aromas and you type in your phone number, you get points for however much money you spend, and then you get the $5 reward. So then you feel like, I'll spend all of this money so I get a free coffee. Well, it's not free coffee. Like, you paid for it. And so indulgences are sort of like a reward card in some ways, that you get points for buying things. Some of them in the Middle Ages are like these little certificates of like, you've been blessed, kind of a thing. It's like, but it's also visiting holy sites. So this is sort of like tourism money almost, that, when you go to the holy site, you pay money to enter it, to like see the relic, to be blessed in the presence of whatever, St. Thomas Aquinas' left toe or left big toe or something like that. I don't know. Some of these relics are weird and odd. St. Bernadette's thigh bone, I think, traveled through here. a few years ago to Our Lady of Lourdes, and my parents called me and they said, it's advertising that you can go get indulgences. What is that? And I said, oh, it's kind of like Catholic points. You know, you're accruing this sort of a reward system. Well, what is it for? In the Middle Ages, it's a bit different now. Like they've sort of altered their theology because it didn't go over well with the whole Reformation situation. But in the Middle Ages, it meant you spend less time in purgatory, or the person that you pay on behalf of spends less time in purgatory. Purgatory, I like to compare to it's like going through customs at the airport, is the way that I like to sort of phrase it, for anybody who's not familiar. So in the Middle Ages, this theology develops that when you die, you don't go to heaven or hell directly. You go to purgatory, and you kind of burn off your sins or your problems, or you're sort of like in a holding. You're just waiting in line. You're waiting in line, and the more you sin, the further back in the line you are. So, and that's like you're kind of waiting to get to heaven. And so people still today in Catholicism will pray for the souls of their lost loved ones. I had a friend, her father passed away, and she sent me this memorial email thing because they were having a virtual funeral for COVID. And she sends me this thing. They're Catholic and very devout, very good people, and love Jesus very much, but buy in 100% to all of the rituals as well. And so she sends me this thing of like, say this many rosaries on this day at this time on behalf of my dad, and if he wound up not needing, the purgatory points, that's not what they call it, but if he doesn't need it, it'll go to benefit the other souls that are waiting there. So it sort of like overflows, like when, you're about to leave the fair and you still have tickets left and you just hand them to somebody. It's that kind of system, right? So people in the Middle Ages are spending tons and tons of money. They're going hungry because there are all these conflicts and famines. The Black Death has happened. People are dying left and right. And they're so worried because their family's dying so unexpectedly. They didn't have time to get it together, to get right with God. They didn't have time to figure out their sort of bad deeds and do good deeds to make up for them. Or, they died right before Lent, which is the worst time to die. Because Lent is sort of where you make up for all the bad stuff you did all year. Especially in the Middle Ages, because their rules are so much stricter back then. Anyway, you don't need it. We'll talk about that some other time. Maybe Easter time. It's very interesting. You look a little interested. That's dangerous. The more interested you look at me, the more you're going to have to hear about this one day. So, people are really concerned about their loved ones, and that's natural. And so they're skipping meals to buy indulgences from the church, which are, it's like little pieces of paper that say, here's an indulgence for you worth whatever. That's not a perfect description, but this is sort of the representation you see when you watch movies about Martin Luther. And they're getting rich off of it. They're really making a lot of money. And they're using it to gild things and build fancy buildings and wear lots of robes. And there's a lot of abuse at the top level, right? Because I'm sorry, I've just lost my train of thought because there's just a lot happening in the room right now. It's fine. So there's a lot of abuse happening at the top level of the church because people are enriching themselves in a lot of ways. But there's also a lot of controversy because you have this instability in the governance of the church because of the Western Schism. So the Western Schism happens because people don't want the Pope to be in France. So they decide to move the papacy back to Rome. The College of Cardinals is the group of guys. They wear red like the bird, but they're not like the bird. But they wear red, and they're very important, and they're appointed by the Pope. It's this whole thing. And so they elect the next Pope. So when Pope Francis either passes away or retires, his College of Cardinals, which he appoints people to the College of Cardinals, and some of them are incredibly old. Some of them are pushing 100 at times. And so, no offense to anybody who's pushing 100. We're glad you're here. But that's a lot. It's pretty old to not be retired. right? And to be making hard decisions that impact the world and their salvation. Because the Pope sets tradition. The Pope decides what goes, and he can make pronouncements and interpretations of Scripture that are essentially laws. It's very much like making a law. And so these people are reacting against that, the abuse of that structure. And so the medieval reformers are not saying like throw out the Pope necessarily, but they're saying that like the way that this is going is not the way that it should go. And so what happens when you have the Western Schism is you have 3 popes. Three is a lot at one time because you can't have 3. You have to have 1. That's the rule. That's like the one rule that the Pope can't undo, probably. Well, there's probably a few of them, but what happens is the College of Cardinals in Rome, who elect the new Roman Pope, they're not happy. They've just moved back from France to Rome, and then they say, well, we've been running things here in Rome, and like without him, and now he's telling us what to do instead of being in France, and we like that's not convenient, and like he's really, it's kind of like you get a new pastor, and he comes and he paints the church like orange, and you're just like, well, excuse me, I was not on the committee that picked orange for this color for the wall, So so they decide we're going to move and elect a new pope and just pretend that didn't happen. But they didn't get rid of him. He's still there, and then he elects his own. He selects his own College of Cardinals. So this is a big deal. You have 2 popes, and then you end up with a 3rd one because they're saying, okay, the best thing to do is just to start over all over again. But then the other 2 are like, no, we didn't agree to that. Like, we're still here. And then they excommunicate one another, and it's a very big situation that's happening. It's very turbulent. And so that undermines the authority of the Catholic Church in the eyes of a lot of people. Because how can you have 2 popes? You can't. So who decides who the Pope is? Well, not God, apparently, because we have 2 guys arguing that they're, and then a 3rd. It gets complicated. So John Huss is the guy that we're talking about, and so I'm going to put this up here. Ooh. So you have Wycliffe, who influences Huss. This is what we do in my class. We have these, I make them do timelines, and they hate it a lot. It's very fun. Today we did it as hangman, which was really fun. So they lost points if they put something out of order. And it's like this drama. It was very fun. And so with Wycliffe you have England, Peasants' Revolt, the 100 Years' War, and I'm not going to write that, okay. And then you have the Western Schism here. But so John Huss and his followers are called the Moravians, and that's on your sheet. And so they'll come up again next time when we talk about John Wesley. But what we see here with John Huss is that Wycliffe is excommunicated. Some other things happen. He passes away while he's sort of being tried for all of this, and while he's trying to work that out, he passed away. Before he could see that completed. And so eventually he's declared a heretic, which is a big thing. And they dig up his body, set it on fire, and throw the ashes in the river. And that's just that's not pleasant, It's not very nice to do to people. And so he's just sort of thinking of him as anything other than a heretic, and reading his work is not a good idea for John Huss. And so John Huss is preaching all of this reform. And he's preaching, greater access of people on the lower end of the totem pole to God, more directly. This is one of his things. And so he's executed, more for insubordination than heresy, but just stack the charges. That's kind of the situation. And so for a while, you have the Western Schism gets worked out, the 100 Years' War ends several decades later. You have all of these things sort of wrapping up kind of at the same time. And you have this sort of relative time where there are other things going on, like in England, there's the Wars of the Roses, and so it's not like there's no conflicts happening, but you have this time of sort of greater stability in Christianity that follows John Huss and the Western Schism. And the Pope really works, the one that they finally pick, really works to like consolidate power, to control, but he's still making a lot of money off of indulgences and all of these other things. And so that's how they're building the Vatican. The Vatican complex that you see today, all that marble, they're building that around this time, around the time of Martin Luther. So this is sort of where we get and I think John Huss might have lived if he had been on the right side of the Western Schism, according to his archbishop, because he and the archbishop were on like different ends of that conflict. And so this is why it plays so much into the politics of what's happening, right, is that John Huss has a lot of followers and a lot of influence, and he disagrees with the archbishop. And so if he's swaying people away from the archbishop's authority, you know, then that becomes a problem. Because if the archbishop isn't in charge, then the pope's not in charge either. So not everybody is really like fighting in these conflicts specifically over religion. You know, these are not wars of religion, like the 100 Years' War is not a religious war, but this is an element. It's a motivating factor, and it's something that draws lines for people. So some people support England against France in the 100 Years' War because they don't think that the papacy should be in France. They think that's wrong. Bridget of Sweden is really notable. She becomes a saint, and she's a Swedish noblewoman, and she writes to, I think it was Edward III, about, you know, England has her support in the 100 Years' War, and she wants to negotiate with the Swedish king to ally with them against France because she thinks that the papacy should not be in France. And that's a really big deal. And the fact that she gets sort of canonized later is also a big deal because the Pope is the one who decides who becomes a saint or not. And so then you get to Martin Luther, which is the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, don't worry. Martin Luther's probably a really familiar name, right? And so he is a big part of sort of the post-Renaissance. He's part of the Reformation. When we talk about the Reformation, we usually start with him. That's not really quite accurate, right? So he's also part of this humanistic intellectual movement. And so humanism is a vehicle for these Reformation ideas to move. People also like to bring up the printing press, like the printing press is a factor, and it is in the movement of these Protestant ideas. But you can see that like over time and throughout these places, you've had these other conflicts going on and these other reform movements being suppressed. This is the theme, right, that we're tracking. This is the pattern that we're layering, is that John Wycliffe and John Huss and all of these other people have been suppressed in their reform movement. They've been handled. They've been dealt with. They do not move forward. They still have followers. There's still Lollards today. There's still Moravians today. They're John Huss's followers. Moravia is a place, and so that's why they're called that. Anyway, you don't need to know that right now. But in case you're wondering, and fun fact, Andy Griffith was a Moravian, and there's like a living history thing. It's very fun. I want to go one day. We should take a field trip. I love field trips. We'll go on a field trip. I'll plan it. After homecoming, oh my gosh, I can't. I'm going to take a hiatus, and then we're going to go on the field trip when the weather thaws. How about that? I'm not going to agree to be in charge of anything else ever again. It's fine. No, we're going to have a great time. So there's also this guy Erasmus, and we're not going to talk about him, but he's really important in terms of like his ideas. He's Dutch, and so the Dutch are going to come back into play again too. But what you see is you see a lot of geographic diversity, you see a lot of conflict happening over other things, and religion gets wrapped up into it. Or maybe like religion starts off a conflict and other things get pulled in, and so then that draws the lines of fighting. Well, in Switzerland, where Ulrich Zwingli is from, there's a lot of fighting anyway. He comes up in conflict. He's sort of like forged by warfare. Luther is not. Martin Luther's a lawyer. I think they're both lawyers. Martin Luther is a lawyer. His family are trying to like move up in their socioeconomic class. So they like send him to learn how to be a lawyer. You don't go to university for that back then in the same way that you do today. And so Martin Luther has this radical conversion moment where he's afraid he's going to die in this lightning storm. And so he calls out to St. Anne, who in tradition says is the mother of the Virgin Mary. And he says, St. Anne, if you save me, like I'll dedicate my life to the church. And he didn't die, so he had to go. And he wound up at a university as a professor in Wittenberg in Germany. And so he like kicks off, you know, he's very famous for his 95 Theses, nailing them to the door. Well, he's part of this longer succession of ideas that have like traveled across time and space, and they're, you know, he didn't come up with these out of nowhere. He didn't just wake up one day inspired, like by the Lord or something. I mean, maybe he was, but like these are ideas that other people have been sort of wrestling with and have been executed over before. And so he's trying to say, you know, I need more reasons why, is part of his sort of push here. And his response is to get excommunicated, and they're trying to suppress him. But there's so much conflict happening. There's so many other people buying into these reform movements that to these ideas, and the ideas are traveling more and further at that point because of the printing press, because of the literacy, because of sort of the rebirth and rejuvenation of society after the trauma of the Black Death. You know, there's a lot of economic development. There's a lot more opportunity for luxury. There's a developing middle class, you might call a middle class. Historians call it the bourgeois class. So when you talk about, you know, the late 15th century and the early 16th century in England, one of the things that historians talk about is this crazy economic development where you have this emergence of a bourgeois class and their engagement in like luxury. So they're buying luxury items and they're doing luxurious things instead of just like working to survive. And so you see that like there's all this shift in the nature of society from warfare and from turmoil and from uncertainty and instability to a time of maybe more stability. There's a lot more prosperity in some places. And so this is where Martin Luther is sort of rising up. And people feel very differently at this point about these reform movements than they do in the past, because it's more personal to them. They're more educated. They're more able to decide for themselves. And they say, why shouldn't I have access to the bread and the wine? Why shouldn't I be able to do these things? Why should I have to buy indulgences? Because this is, and Martin Luther is seeing, you know, these churches are kind of empty. There's nothing that people don't know how to believe things. They don't know how, and so he's worried that there are people going to hell because they didn't know that they had to do something, that they had to believe something themselves. They go to church and they think that's enough. And Martin Luther is like, if you come to church but you don't have, you know, this like personal buy-in, this personal relationship with God, or this personal care about your salvation, like how can you have any chance at going to heaven? How can you have any chance of like being part of this community of saints? And so this is sort of where, you know, Luther's concerned. The church failed at its number one task, which is to introduce people to the gospel and to help them get to heaven. And so there are a lot of layers to this, right, that we're skipping over because we've just tracked like several hundred years of history in like 40 minutes of time. So 45 minutes, I don't know. So, you know, you see this huge war erupt across Europe in the midst of the Lutheran Reformation, right? Where people are fighting, and then Europe is not countries like we see it today at this time. They're more like principalities and duchies and things like that. And so you have these princes who are sort of in charge of their little corner, their city-state, something like that. And they're all warring with each other because this one's Catholic and this one's Protestant, and this one doesn't want to be under the authority of the Pope, but this one thinks that they should. And so this is also a good excuse of like, I'm going to conquer my neighbor and have more territory. So there are a lot of like elements involved in this. It's not just about religion. It's about a lot of other things too. But you see that like religion is really the dividing line here, and you have reformers. Even still today in Germany, you sort of pick if you're, they call it evangelical, but you pick if you're like Protestant or Catholic, and that determines a lot about your education and like your health services and like where you get buried, even though a lot of people aren't religious at all anymore, or like, you know, there's like Buddhism and Hinduism and all of these things in this multicultural society. But it's still, you still see these like dividing lines historically, like from history in modern society. And so this is a really interesting sort of long-lasting impact of this conflict, where you've seen this conflict drawn along these lines, and now these are lines that are going to be battle lines for centuries, and it's going to shape alliances. And when England becomes Protestant as well, you know, you kind of see, you see it in America, even in the settlement of the Americas, of like who allies with one another against who. England and Spain and England and France are going to continue to butt heads and to have conflict for hundreds and hundreds of years because of this religious difference, among other things, among a lot of other things. But the Pope, one of the things that was sort of his job was to make peace and keep peace between Christian leaders. But if he's no longer an authority over you, you can do whatever you want. Not really, but they think they can. And so this is a big introduction into turmoil, is that the Pope has no authority to mediate this dispute because these people have a problem with the Pope and with his authority. And by excommunicating them, instead of like bringing them back in under his authority and having them be like, oh, I'm so sorry, because to be excommunicated is to be removed from the fellowship of the church, to be removed from access to the sacraments. You cannot be a Christian and like go to heaven if you're in a state of being excommunicated. And so, but Luther said, I'm going to take this into my own hands and work it out with God myself. And when he did that, and other people followed suit, now the Pope cannot mediate this dispute because he can't bring these people back under his control. And so this is the big breakdown that sort of sets the tone for how Christianity is going to develop and how these kind of revival movements are going to be shaped for hundreds of years up until the modern day. We're still in the midst of this, right? Because there's no ecumenical movement that is reuniting Protestants and Catholics. We're still on very different sides of the discussion. We're not talking in the same terms. You know, we don't have purgatory or excommunication or transubstantiation or saints. Not in the same way. So, and we don't have indulgences, so you can't rack up any points here, unfortunately. But we don't have purgatory either, so I don't know if that's good or bad for us. But there's more that we'll talk about you know, the English Reformation and how things develop, and looking forward, because we're going to talk about John Wesley and his influences. And these are his influences, and he creates this system of theology that really changes the world because it develops into the Methodist Church. And so the Methodist Church has a really large role in the First and Second Great Awakenings. And so all of these developments start to stack up like dominoes after a little while. And so this is kind of your introduction to the state of things. And then we'll talk about, with a more focused lens, some other topics next week. And we will cover less years of time. Any questions?
Did you go see the 5-0?
I did not. I wasn't here. I would have. I 100% would have. Yeah. I've been to a few. I've seen some relics. They're really creepy. There's one that's just a head. St. Catherine. Ooh. Ooh. Ick. Don't Google pictures. That was a mistake. That was a mistake that I made.
My question is, how did we get from the upper room in Acts to all of this? It's so, I mean, to the best I can, I understand what you're talking about, but it's just so involved and so deep and so intricate. You know, how in the world?
So the Acts Church and some of the church fathers that follow them, the leaders, they are all living in a state of persecution by the Roman Empire. You think of Nero and like Paul the Apostle and like people being executed for their faith and imprisoned and that sort of thing. So as the Roman Empire sort of grows and expands and wanes a little in its ability to like manage things, you have Constantine, the emperor, and his conversion, right? And so there's like this story that like he's on a battlefield and he cries out to the Christian God and he gets a sign and then they win the battle and all this stuff. And so he's very like famous, and his mother is Saint Helen, and so she allegedly like found like the 3 holiest sites, like the Holy Sepulchre and like the Temple of Solomon and some other things that become some of the holiest pilgrimage sites in Catholicism. And so Constantine says, okay, you guys are really disorganized, and you've been persecuted a long time. Like Christianity is legal at that point, but they're struggling to organize themselves. So he calls for, I'm going to say the wrong thing on the internet, aren't I? Is it the Council of Nicaea, I think, that he calls? It's been a long day. No one hold it against me if I got that wrong. But in his councils, he puts people together in a room and says, figure it out. And so what they develop is an authority structure that mimics the Roman authority structure. So the diocese is run by a bishop, and well, that's like just that's just how the Roman government works. But they have sort of a religious mirror. And this is where you get like all of these schisms, right? That Peter's primacy means that like Peter was the Pope of Rome by tradition, and whoever is the Pope of Rome is then like in charge because Jesus said, on this rock I shall build my church, and like he's talking to Peter. And so they have this idea that like Peter is the in charge apostle, is where they get that. And so they decide that, well, that's how you get the break with the Eastern Church, is because they say, well, we have apostolic succession. We were started by an apostle. Our patriarch was apostle whoever. It's not coming to mind right now. It's been a while since I read that textbook. And so over time, when like the Roman Empire is falling, the structure that remains as the government structure crumbles is the structure of the church. So you have like the bishops, you have the priests, and so you have this this authority structure, and you have like the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who's sort of holding it all together. And so you have some stories of like conquerors come to Rome, and the government has all fled and the walls have fallen, but the Pope is still there. And he works with like the Gothic conquerors, that sort of thing, and he converts a lot of them. And so you have this like grand tale of all this sort of stuff. And so over time, as these leaders convert, because Rome and like the Holy Roman Empire, it becomes the Holy Roman Empire. This is such a rich land, like people want to conquer it. And so if you have the Pope on your side, if you convert to Christianity, you have a good relationship with him, he's so powerful that like things are going to go well for you. And so it becomes this system where like people want to befriend the Pope, and they want to sort of like be endorsed by him. And so he grows in power and authority as people convert to Christianity, but also because he holds so much influence in all of these ways. And so you see like this very large structure develop where kings are saying like, send me some priests, send me some monks, I'll build them a monastery. And they standardize a lot of things, right? Like Latin. If you know Latin, like you can talk to people. You can trade. You're part of this bigger network with all of these sort of opportunities. And so there are a lot of reasons beyond just like believing in the gospel to like join up with the system. And there's a lot of sort of multiplicity, I guess, of motivations that people have to buy in and to invest in the Pope's authority. And there's this investiture crisis too, where it's like, who gets to appoint bishops, the kings or the Pope? You know, so like, should the English king have a say in who his archbishop is, or who the bishops in his land are, or should they only be appointed like by the Pope and by, you know, the Pope's appointed archbishop? And so you have a lot of conflict as well over time. So but they grow also because they're landowners, and they gain all of this territory in the Papal States. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to the process of being this really disorganized, grassroots religious movement based on, personal connection with Jesus to this huge bureaucratic system. And this is hundreds of years. You have a little less than 1,000 years between, you have about 1,350 years between Wycliffe and, the upper room. That's a lot of time.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time. Does anybody else have questions? Okay, I'm going to quit holding you hostage now. But
My question was short. Well, when you take into consideration 1,000 years, that's a lot of time for people to do their own thing.
there's more time between the upper room and Wycliffe than there is between Wycliffe and us. A lot more time. So, but you see how much it's changed between Wycliffe and his sort of yelling into these kind of controversial ideas that people are maybe not ready to talk about. And today, where you can say whatever you want. You can start your own religion if you want to. That's legal in America.
His Bible translators are still working.
Yes, so that's one of the things that Wycliffe's known for, is that he started a translation of the Bible. He believed that people should be able to read the scripture themselves in their own language. And so William Tyndale really also picks up that effort during the Lutheran Reformation. And he's an Englishman, and he smuggles Bibles back into England. It's a whole thing. But Wycliffe really didn't, historians don't think that he really actually translated that much himself, but he was part of it. It's kind of interesting. You can read the Wycliffe Bible, the one that was translated by him and his friends or his colleagues on Bible Gateway. It's very interesting. It's not complete, but there's a lot that you can read. I recommend it. It's very interesting. If people want to keep asking questions, they can, but I'm gonna shut this down, this technology element, and turn my microphone off. Thanks for joining online, if anybody's still there. See you next week, for better or worse.